Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance for GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox, although it was later released on the Game Boy Advance as Mortal Kombat Tournament Edition. What you're seeing here is the GameCube version. This is a 3D fighting game developed and published by Midway Games and released in November of 2002 on varying days. So it started with the PlayStation 2 version, then the GameCube and Xbox versions came out, and finally the Game Boy Advance versions, all within the span of a few days. And it was generally pretty well received. Most people seemed to like it and generally considered it to basically revitalize what was considered to be a slowly dying franchise as of MK4. But this was a noted departure from the rest of the series. First off, the fact that there are so many combos that are explicitly formulaic, as well as the characters each having 3 different fighting styles, 2 of which are just basic fighting styles, and then 1 of which is a weapon fighting style. And then also the addition of 3D movement, where you can actually move in full 3 dimensions, as opposed to the series' traditional 2D fighting. There are of course other things that are different between this and the previous games, but I'm going to leave that more for when I actually come across it in the actual review. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on this thing and find out whether all of these changes to the Mortal Kombat formula were worth it, or whether it was something else entirely. Well, as far as presentation goes, this thing definitely looks leagues above Mortal Kombat 4, but that's to be expected considering the time between the two. But even then, this thing actually holds up surprisingly well despite its age. Sure, it looks really dated by modern standards, but the modeling is actually fairly solid. The animations generally are fairly smooth, although there are a few here and there that are rather janky. The textures are obviously pretty low res, and they're really the weakest part of the presentation, other than the fact that if you scale this thing up, it ends up looking rather blurry. But that's of course to be expected. It's not like the GameCube rendered in anything higher than 480p. But then there are a few effects that really stand out. First, the reflective surfaces in the actual maps are actually pretty impressive for the time. Second, when you're actually fighting, you're seeing a lot of blood spraying all over the place, and it does actually slide down the characters' bodies, and you do see them gradually get more and more beat up over time, so that's actually pretty cool, but the way it slides down the bodies just looks hilariously bad. And the actual blood spurting out of the bodies looks hilariously bad. It's basically like a bunch of globs that have been connected together and they just shoot out in a straight or slightly curved line. It looks pretty ridiculous when you really get down to it. Similarly ridiculous are the gore effects in this thing when you actually execute fatalities, which look pretty pathetic actually, and that's both in the fact that a lot of the fatalities are just really wimpy fatalities, like just jumping and stomping on a person's head, or just throwing them around for a bit and then jumping on their corpse when it's laying on the ground so you can absorb their soul. There's a lot of really weak fatalities in this thing, and the gore effects really don't help that. I mean, just look at it.
Wins. Fatality.
It's actually kind of funny to look back at some of these older games after looking at Mortal Kombat 9 and Mortal Kombat X, because just think about how crazy the gore effects have gotten to where they're just incredibly gruesome now. And in this, you don't get that so much as you get actually some pretty cheesy gore effects that really aren't very good. There is also an issue you may have noticed in some of this gameplay footage, but on certain maps, the game actually does have some frame rate issues because it's trying to render too much at once. Namely, it's trying to render snow effects, as well as the reflection effect, as well as the fight that's going on, as well as any physics stuff that's going on in that particular moment. So it actually has a bit of a hard time keeping up on certain maps. Most of them are fine, it's just mostly this one here where it's on the ice. Now I don't really know whether that's a problem on the PS2 or Xbox versions, but on the GameCube it does have some very slight frame rate issues here and there. It's nothing that's really going to make or break the game for you, because it's only in very specific instances, but sometimes it can get mildly annoying. Moving past the visuals, the sound design is something of a mixed bag. There's barely any voice acting in this game at all, and what there is incredibly cheesy and frankly pretty bad, although the voice acting when you're actually in the middle of a fight is just so ridiculous you can't help but at least chuckle at it a couple of times before it starts to get annoying. The sound effects generally work fairly well, although it would have been nicer if they had some more high impact sounds, so when you really start dishing out the damage it starts to sound like you're really just laying into the person, as opposed to just basically making the exact same sounds that it makes whenever you just lightly smack them around as well. And then you got the music, which is definitely Mortal Kombat in tone. It's kind of this mix of a sort of orchestral feel but also a slightly techno feel, and it works pretty well for the most part, although it's not really all that memorable. In fact, the only track I can actually remember off the top of my head, other than the character select screen music, is the licensed track Immortal by the rock band Edema. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because that song actually isn't very good. But at least other than that particular tune, the soundtrack itself generally works fairly well. It's just, I wish that it was more memorable. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is actually kind of convoluted because it's split between the arcade mode and the Conquest mode. But the basic premise is that the sorcerers Quan Chi and Shang Tsung have actually formed an alliance so that they can actually bring back this undefeatable undead army from the long-forgotten ruler of Outworld who was known as the Dragon King. But before they summon this army, they go and use their combined strength to kill both Shao Kahn and Liu Kang, who are the two greatest threats to their plans, and then they go about trying to resurrect this army for themselves. Each other character has their own specific storyline, and that is summarized both in the Conquest mode and in the arcade mode. The arcade mode being pretty much what you would expect after having played just about any other fighting game out there, since it's just a matter of going through a series of stages with increasingly difficult opponents and eventually getting to the final boss and defeating them. After beating the boss, you are treated to a summary of the storyline that is basically an inroad to the next Mortal Kombat game, as well as a sort of conclusion to the specific Deadly Alliance story for that specific character. Now, it should be noted that a lot of these endings are actually conflicting with one another, and it's not really until you get to Mortal Kombat Deception that all is really made clear. Well, as clear as Deadly Alliance, Deception, and ultimately Armageddon get anyway. Because the stories of the various characters are a bit jumbled and a bit hard to follow at times, which makes it kind of confusing going between the Conquest and the arcade mode. Because the Conquest basically sets up the character, and then the arcade mode finishes that character. Which of course brings me to the difference between the Conquest and arcade mode themselves. Conquest mode is basically an extended tutorial. You start off with 8 missions where you play as Sub-Zero and go through the absolute basics of what you need to be doing. Movement, blocking, the fact that there are various attack types, that sort of thing. From there, you are taken to the character select screen where you pick a character of your choice and you go through 10 missions as that character. It starts you off with the basics of that character, their individual moves, and then moves on into special moves, combos, transitionary combos where you actually transition between your fighting styles, and finally it puts you in a match against yourself, basically. It puts you in a mirror match, and it's like, okay, defeat your opponent. And once you beat that mission, you're taken back to the character select screen where you can pick another character and continue the process. It's basically an extended tutorial, and it's kind of appreciated but at the same time kind of irritating, because the missions will not progress unless you actually manage to pull things off, and certain combos are either really long or actually surprisingly hard to pull off. They take perfect timing, and that's not necessarily something you're going to get on the first try. There are just certain characters I absolutely hate playing because their combos are either hard to pull off, or their combos are really long and hard to remember, or they're just not very interesting character designs. So when I did go through the entirety of Conquest mode, I basically ended up screwing myself over by playing all the characters I wanted to play as first, and then going through the rest of the characters that I really didn't want to play all that much, but I just kind of forced myself through. That meant the first few characters worth of Conquest mode was actually fairly okay, but when I got to the rest of the Conquest mode, it got more and more irritating as I went on. The thing is, you have to play through the entirety of Conquest mode if you want to unlock the 2 secret characters, which are Blaze and Mocap. Granted, there's not much reason to unlock them because despite them actually looking kind of amusing, they don't have fatalities and they each only have 3 martial arts styles as opposed to 2 martial arts and a weapon style. Now, the real draw of Conquest mode is actually earning a very large amount of coins. These coins are used to unlock things in the crypt, which can be anything from character art to concept art for stages, unlocking stages themselves, unlocking alternate costumes for your characters, or even unlocking wonderful bits like this.
This week on Cooking with Scorpion, learn about chopping, tenderizing, chopping, cake decorating, and chopping.
Obviously, the developers had quite a bit of fun making this, but the sheer amount of unlockables is actually kind of staggering. But despite the sheer amount of unlockables, the fact that there's only really 2 modes of play, one of which is just basically a glorified tutorial and the other of which is just a standard arcade mode, coupled with the fact that the roster actually isn't particularly strong, with several series staples being conspicuously absent and being replaced by characters like Mavado and Natara and Suhao, all of which are actually really pathetic. So basically, unless a character is returning from a previous Mortal Kombat game, they're not a compelling, interesting character. The only real exception to that is Kenshi, who went on to become much more interesting in later Mortal Kombat games than he did in Deadly Alliance. And the only other distant second was Frost, and Frost is really just a female Sub-Zero when you get down to it. So most of the new characters just aren't really all that interesting, and you end up sticking to the ones you know who are actually kind of interesting, like, say, Scorpion, Shang Tsung, Sub-Zero, Sonya, Johnny Cage, Kung Lao, Kano, Katana, Reptile, Cyrax, Jax, hell, even friggin' Quan Chi is from a previous Mortal Kombat game. He's from MK4. Because you already know all of their special abilities, so learning those over again is really just a matter of, oh, which button is it that I press, because I already know the combination for the movements, just what button is it that actually triggers the ability. At least if they even still have that ability, because some of them are actually missing, like, say, the whirlwind spin that Kung Lao used to be able to do, now he can't do it in this. So that kind of thing is actually fairly disappointing, but when you get past that, the new fighting system is really going to take quite a bit of getting used to. This is due to the addition of 3-dimensional movement, so you can actually sidestep into the background and into the foreground as you wish to avoid attacks and such, as well as the addition of the fighting styles. Now, the addition of fighting styles makes it seem like each style has its own strengths and weaknesses, like there's actually a lot of strategy to it, but in reality it's basically just, okay, you switch fighting styles, now you have a new set of moves and combos. That's really it. The only noticeable difference is when you're using the weapon style, in which case you actually take more damage even though you do dish out more damage as well. So there is some degree of strategy involved in switching over to your weapon style at a good time versus when it's not a good time to switch over to it. But other than that, it's really just a matter of memorizing a bunch of different combos in a couple of fighting styles and just switching to whichever one you feel you can do at any given moment. Part of the problem with that is that the combat itself actually feels very sluggish and often kind of unresponsive. To give you a prime example, there are numerous combos that will go between the fighting styles, and some of them which go between all 3 of them all in one sequence. And if you can pull those off, then you can actually deal a pretty good amount of damage all at once without the enemy being able to do much of anything about it. The problem is that sometimes the game will not register a button press being at the right time in order to continue the combo, and it will just end up stopping the combo in its tracks. You do see this in other fighting games as well, but in this one it's especially problematic because all of the attacks in this game are actually relatively slow and clunky. And this is only made worse by the addition of the 3D movement. While it is certainly nice to have that additional element of strategy where you can dodge to the side out of the way of an attack, or you can move out of the way before someone starts hitting you with a combo, if someone's already in a combo, they'll just keep going in the direction they were going to begin with, which leaves them wide open. There's not really much getting out of combos once you've started them up, and it can be incredibly irritating when you start a combo and they move out of the way, and then you're continuing the combo even though you're actually kind of sitting there doing nothing. This is because there's a slight delay between when you end an attack and when you can actually move again. and that slight delay is enough to prevent you from actually being able to change direction or just straight up get out of a combo while you're still doing it. And that's not at all helped by the fact that instead of using the analog stick, you actually use the D-pad only. So movement itself feels actually pretty stiff, and the actual attacks feel pretty stiff as well, so you don't really feel like you have full smooth control over your character, and thus the core fighting mechanics actually feel incredibly clunky as a result. And once you realize that and you start looking more into the way that combos work and everything, you find that certain characters are just straight up better than others because they have longer, more powerful combos. You can actually just look at the move lists and tell which characters they put a lot of effort into and which ones they didn't. Hint, it's actually all of the classic Mortal Kombat characters as well as Kenshi and to a lesser degree Frost that got all the effort put into them. But here's the really big problem with this. Deadly Alliance came out at the tail end of 2002. A few other 3D fighting games that came out that year: Soul Calibur 2, Tekken 4, and Dead or Alive 3. This thing just doesn't hold a candle to those. The only two things that this brings to the table that those games don't are the fighting styles and the fact that it's Mortal Kombat, so you get blood and gore and fatalities. And sadly, there's only one fatality per character, and most of the fatalities in this are actually pretty pathetic. So in the long run, Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance just ends up being pretty disappointing when you really start to think about it. It has some ideas that seem cool at first, but when you really start to delve into this game, and you really start to play it heavily, all of the issues start to outpace the things that seem cool at first, and what you end up with is just an extremely lackluster title that really doesn't add much to the Mortal Kombat franchise other than, hey, we're still kind of relevant in the 3D era. Pretty much the only people I can actually recommend this to are die-hard Mortal Kombat fans, and that's only for the sake of completeness. It's really not a very good game. It's not a very good Mortal Kombat game. It's not a very good fighting game in general. It just has some cool ideas that just don't pan out, and it has fairly impressive visuals for its time. That's pretty much it, really. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of much worse fighting games out there, but you could do a hell of a lot better than Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, even in its day. I give it a 2.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.